the research arm of the Progressive Policy Institute, which was sort of the sort of moderate wing of the Democratic Party, the sort of Hillary Clinton wing, and so on. And so I talked about marriage as a public policy. It's sort of something that we could do to encourage marriage as a way to reduce poverty. And a lot of people talk about this all the time. And my take on it, I wrote another one with Andrea Kane for the Center on Children and Families at the Brookings Institute. And the main point that I've been trying to make is that reducing unwed childbearing is really the missing link in efforts to promote marriage. And the argument that I've been making, and made quite a bit, is that the best marriage promotion policy is one that reduces out-of-wedlock childbearing. And what I've done is I've done work that's looked at unwed mothers being much less likely to get married, or if they do get married, they don't stay married. I think some of the work that we've done showed that maybe 25 to 30% of those women who got pregnant and then later married, only about 25% were still married by age 40. So we're talking about very unstable marriages. And then lastly, whether you have a child outside of marriage or not also affects the kind of man that you end up marrying, whether that man can lift you out of poverty and off welfare. And women who have children outside of marriage tend to marry less well by almost any standard. So my argument has always been, there's nothing wrong with marriage promotion. In fact, we're talking about a small amount of money. It's still early in the process whether these things work or not. But I think it's really important to work on the issue of out-of-wedlock childbearing, especially in a time when about 70% of black kids are born to single mothers, 50% of Hispanic kids are born to single mothers, and about 41%, 42% now are born outside of marriage. And about 60% of all non-marital births in the United States are to cohabiting couples. So cohabitation is an increasingly important context for childbearing and child rearing. And these are all threats to, I think, in some ways, to the American future and to the stability of marriage. So what else should we do? What else should we do? And I want to just say a few things here that are, in some way, maybe you think of them as more bromides than real solutions. But I want us to start thinking really big. And I see the issue of poverty as really a matter of political will. A lot of us who do research in the poverty research community, we've been doing the same sort of studies for 30, 40 years, since the 1960s, to see what works. And, does raising the minimum wage work? And we're always talking about little tiny increments and whether they're going to have a little tiny effect. We're always like dabbling around the edges of these policies. It seems like we need a strategic goal and a strategic plan, and we really need to think outside the box about what we can do collectively as a society to promote the well-being of children. We really need to think big. The other general point I wanted to make is that we need to think about investing in these kids now, because 20 years from now they're going to be taking their places as productive or not members of American society. And one political strategy that sometimes comes up is we need policies that address all kids, not just poor kids or not just minority kids, but we need to do something that has political momentum behind it, that everybody can get behind. And that means we need to support strong schools generally. We need to support strong communities generally. We need to support strong families generally, not just for poor and minority families. We have to have a coalition that around building strengths overall. As I said, the social science community is not particularly good and doesn't have a particularly good record about making really effective policy proposals. At least I don't think it does. And the things that they focus on tends to be much too little, much too incremental. And we need to think beyond the box. So we can talk about the science, the facts, and we can talk about how to evaluate different kinds of policies, whether raising the minimum wage works or not. But in the end, I think helping children is a collective effort that reflects our own politics. It reflects our values. And you need to take the information that we produce in the evaluations of these different programs, and you need to decide whether this is important to you. And I'm speaking generically with you. So one type of thinking big, and this, I don't know that even this is thinking big. This is the report that got quite a bit of attention a couple of weeks ago, and this is the Children's Defense Fund, Ending Child Poverty Now. And they say that $77 million could reduce child poverty by 60%, lifting 66 million children out of poverty. So they're making a big plea for reducing poverty, and what they're doing is to try to develop some sort of political consensus. They're trying to to focus on tried and true programs that had been successful on a small scale perhaps in the past that might elevate the economic status of kids and support stronger families. And I'm not going to go through all these, but I want to just, because I don't want to get really down in the weeds here, and I can share the PowerPoint. We're talking about things like increasing the earned income tax credit or changing the minimum wage, creating subsidized employment for people who aren't working and so on, child care facilities. How do we, and I think both sides of the political spectrum, I think, believe that we need to make work pay, we need to provide work supports to allow people to work in the labor force at a wage that can support a family in a decent way. The other one is that they've put a lot of emphasis on how do we ensure children's basic needs. So we can provide income, but we can also identify those things that kids are lacking and try to address them really directly. And again, in this Children's Defense Fund, they're talking about improving the nutrition for kids through food stamps. They're talking about child tax credits, making them fully refundable, and so on. So there are very concrete things that one could do in order to address these things. And of course, this always gets into the question about, yes, this is all true, this is all pie in the sky, and we've heard all this stuff a million times. And it sort of like goes in one ear and out the other. And because we've heard it so much, and it doesn't resonate with people very much anymore, I don't think, in some ways. And the question sometimes that comes up is, how do we pay for this? And you know, I was talking to somebody at Mississippi who's in the state governor's office there, and he's always telling his governor, he says, you know, you can pay now or you can pay later, and it's going to cost a whole lot more later. And so if you think about kids as an investment, you don't pay for it later in the terms of higher incarceration or unemployment compensation or different cash welfare assistance programs or fatherless homes and so on. So you pay it up front rather than behind, and sometimes that's a hard concept to think about. And there's usually sort of two ways. I mean, you can think about this as, what are the market? And I don't know the answer to this, but what are the market solutions to these problems that can grow the economy and also grow the tax base that can be used to support kids in a positive way? Or alternatively, like the Children's Defense Fund, what they would like to do is more on the progressive or liberal side, is reduce military spending. They talk about wastage in the military spending. They talk about changing the tax code and so on for corporations and eliminating loopholes and so on. But it seems to me we need to put everything on the board, on the table. We need to talk about all kinds of solutions. We need to talk about poverty and we need to talk about the will to reduce it, and then what together on both sides of the political spectrum that can address children's current circumstances. And we need to think about them as an investment for the future. This is at the bottom of this Children's Defense Fund. They say shrinking child poverty would bring child poverty in the U.S. in line with rates in other high-income countries and help prevent poverty in the future. As the wealthy and powerful nation we are, it is way past time we commit to ensuring children's basic needs. And we all want to address kids' basic needs. None of us, I don't think, wants to see child poverty. But do we have the political will to make it happen? And when we look at the United States and we see how our values are reflected in the statistics, it's pretty disheartening sometimes. At least it's disheartening for me. This is a chart that just lists the U.S. ranks second to last among all these different countries in terms of levels of poverty. This is the percent of children living in households with incomes less than 50% of the national median income. And you can see some of these countries, like some of the Scandinavian countries like Sweden or the Netherlands, Denmark, we're talking about poverty rates that are 4 or 5%. And we get all the way up to the children in the United States where maybe a quarter of the children are poor. And we're not talking about a whole lot of income here. We're talking about $20,000 roughly for a family of four that are poor even by this definition. Okay, so let me conclude here. I know we're running out of time. Maybe some of you can still catch the second half to the St. Mary's basketball game. So the implications, just to sort of recreate my argument. The implications of America's racial transformation, this third demographic transformation over the next 25 years, I think, is potentially profound. It's going to radically change America as older white people like myself, and you've seen the age distribution, are going to pass away, and they're going to be replaced by today's younger generation. Today's poverty among immigrants and minority children compromises, I hope I've demonstrated here, compromises their developmental trajectories and their likelihood of assuming productive adult roles that, as taxpayers, as leaders, as good citizens. Again, what we do or don't do matters. And the threats to children, I think, are heightened perhaps as never before. Certainly in a way that wasn't evident when I grew up in South Dakota with my loving parents in a strong faith community, in a strong community that wasn't divided by race and class to the same, that supported its public schools. The threats today are innumerable. We can talk about growing inequality. We can talk about incarceration, unauthorized immigration, family instability. None of these things were really in existence to the same extent that is apparent today. And the kids are on the front lines of these social changes. How are they going to make their way into productive adult roles and replace people like me down the line? In the meantime, on the other hand, we seem to be removing the safety net in many ways and disinvesting in kids. And so just to leave you at the last thought is that America's future maybe more than ever, we need to think about some strategic goals, a strategic plan to address poverty, and we need to invest in kids now, because 20 years from now isn't very, very far from now. And so thank you very much. Thank you for listening. And I hope, by the way, that, I don't know the solutions here. I can tell you some of the facts, but there are a lot of people here at BYU who are very engaged in these sort of outreach to a large global community and have better ideas perhaps than I do about how we can address the issues of poverty and inequality, especially for the benefit of the kids, who I think are going to be so vital for America's future, especially in this new global economy that we're all facing. So thank you all very much.
We have time for just a few questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we have some microphones that we'll distribute to you so we can hear your question, but please be brief.
Yes, right there. Yes.
So just a question that I had while you were presenting your information, just towards the end where it was talking about how politics is being involved with this now, and the programs that they were putting forth, the funds, and how they were saying how can we pay for all of this. Just with personal experience that I saw, I was a missionary for the LDS Church in Missouri and Kansas, and something that we saw was that they abused a lot of the government assistance and the sustenance that they were helping with families who were needing help, and kind of helping them get out of poverty and helping children get out of poverty. There was just a lot of abuse going on with that. Is that something that you wanted to also? I'm pretty sure you've already covered that and obviously seen those areas, but what would you say about that?
About just whether there's fraud and abuse of the system?
Yeah, because I know there's always going to be abuse in any kind of system, but what's the kind of aspect, what's the kind of direction that they would take with that?
Well, I mean, the abuse issue always comes up, and in some ways that's the cost of business, okay? That's one thing. But I guess the problem I have even for bringing up the topic sometimes is that it always strikes me as strange, not strange, it always strikes me as I always have a hard time when we think about people who are cheating the system that don't deserve it, and then saying there are people cheating the system that don't deserve it, therefore we're going to take it away from the truly needy who do need it. So it seems like you're punishing the people by this tiny percent. I think they just did a drug test or something in one of the states here recently, looking at drug tests to whether you can receive cash assistance of some, and it was some tiny little small fraction of the population that was actually on drugs. So I guess that's my general response. And I don't know how to answer that very well because I hear that all the time. But I always think about the people who are then denied food stamps or whatever when they truly need them. And when you look at overall poor people in the United States, the majority of poor people in the United States aren't able-bodied male workers. They're children, they're disabled people, they're the elderly who aren't generally expected to work. So, that's sort of my reaction. Yes?
So I was really interested in statistics you had about women, single mothers and wanting to be married.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any statistics about fathers or about men? And is there and how they feel about marriage or about being married or having families or supporting families?
Right. I mean, one of the big components of and we have several people here at BYU, one of the big components of this Healthy Marriage Initiative is not just to provide marriage education, marriage counseling, and so on, to try to keep fragile families together. But the other part of them is there's a big responsible fatherhood initiative that's also part of it. And that's a more difficult part, to be frank, because a lot of men haven't been terribly involved in these healthy marriage programs. They don't accompany their spouses and so on. And I think this is why in some cases the welfare social welfare workers and so on sometimes see the fathers really and the men really as a big part of the problem. They sabotage relationships. They sabotage women's work relationships. They make it more difficult for them to work and so on. So the Responsible Fatherhood Initiative is part of this legislation. And there's all kinds of programs. Again, we're talking about little programs that see whether if they can work with fathers to make them better providers, better fathers, better partners. And again, the question I always have on all these little experiments, and not everybody in the room will probably agree with me, the problem I always have is it's just a really small scale, and there's almost no way you can ever ratchet these things up to a national scale to make them work for everybody. They work in one little community here and there, but they're not something that works across the board that you can apply everywhere. So it's going to have a very tiny localized effect if it has any effect whatsoever. But people haven't forgot about fathers. I think fathers is where President Obama, for example, is putting all the effort now in the Healthy Marriage Initiative, is to try to make men more responsible with their families. So it's a good point. Yes?
You commented about where you grew up and how you grew up. And I was just wondering if you could speak to the kind of the disintegration of the community